And the real key question was, what happens to people when they're laid off? And why do some people experience what I call career renewal? And why do some people not?
That is Nayla Bahri, a former dean of students at Columbia Business School. Nayla has a PhD in adult learning and leadership. And in today's episode, she shares the key insights from her research on career resilience. Nayla interviewed professionals who lost their jobs during the Great Recession and studied their subsequent trajectory. After that setback, some of the professionals truly flourished and ended up far better off than before they got fired. Some managed to get back to a similar role and their career plateaued. And some got derailed and didn't really recover. Nayla sought to identify the factors that differentiated these groups. And the good news is that it wasn't personality or some unchangeable characteristic, but behaviors that are under our control. Hello, Nayla. It is awesome to have you on the show.
I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Nayla, you and I became friends almost 2 decades ago when I was at Columbia Business School, and you were, I guess, the assistant or associate dean of students, and it's been great having the friendship over these years. And really thrilled to have you on the show today. You've done some research on how people thrive in times of chaos in the career. I think you, for your PhD, you interviewed a bunch of people who had been laid off and figured out, who became successful and who not. And it's so relevant to folks listening to the show, which is all about how to thrive as an independent professional. Maybe we start there. Just tell me a little bit about your research and kind of what you've been doing since Columbia.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, you and I met when I was at Columbia Business School, where I spent almost 20 years myself working. And most of that time I spent in that Dean of Students role. And so the great thing there were so many great things about that role at that time. But one of the great things was that I developed all these relationships with current students. And then as time would pass and they would graduate and move on to whatever it is they were doing next, they'd come back, and sometimes they were back because they were recruiting on campus, or they were guest lecturing in a class. And sometimes they came back because they were making an adjustment in their career and they wanted the resources that the school provided, some of which were your traditional career development resources, and some of which were the network and the people that you knew at the school. So I really loved that part too. I love working with students and being with current students, but I also loved that the school ended up being this kind of home base, especially for the New York-based population. And while I was at the school for all these years, I was also pursuing my doctorate, which took me a very long time. We can talk about that later. But I really made the decision at one point that I was going to use something I had access to be the kind of foundation of my research. And I was always really interested. I was at the school from the late 90s until about 3 years ago, so 2015. And we were experiencing all the ups and downs of the marketplace and the changes in the economy. And so people were coming in and out of the school at different phases in their careers. And I was so curious about how people were handling the ups and downs that were just part of the life cycle. And so over the years, I might have 100 students come in and out who were alums of my office. And I would just be curious, why are some of them handling all these ups and downs so well? And why are some of them just flattened by a setback? And what makes it possible for some people to bounce back and have that experience of renewal? And why do some people not? And so when it came time to kind of build a study for my dissertation, I thought, why not start there? Why not start with this observation and this interest I have that there are differences in how people cope with the ups and downs of either career satisfaction or employment period, all the different flavors that stuff comes in. And for the purposes of a study, I had to be pretty precise about what I was looking at. So it was probably 2012 when I got really specific about my dissertation. And we were a couple of years out of the Great Recession, and I had seen a number of alums and friends and family members affected by the recession. I thought, let's just look at that. Let's look at people who were impacted by the recession, laid off, and let's understand what happened to them and what they learned through the experience and what's happening to them now. So over probably 3 years, I ended up interviewing about 100 people, 24 of whom appear in my dissertation. And the real key question was, what happens to people when they're laid off? And why do some people experience what I call career renewal, and why do some people not? So I can tell you what I think career renewal is. Would that be helpful?
Yeah. What is career renewal, Nayla?
So one of the psychological phenomenons I looked at is this thing called job involvement, which is basically, how do you relate to your work? How do you have a relationship with your work? And there's a lot of work around this concept, because all of us are in a relationship with work, right? And I often use the metaphor of romantic relationship with work. So you'll probably hear that once or twice in the course of our conversation. But the way I define renewal is that people feel space and creativity and optimism in their job relationship rather than feeling trapped or negative. They feel a sense of choice rather than being subject, right? So rather than being kind of passively stuck in a job, they feel like they've actively made the decision to be there, be involved in the work they're doing. And they feel really confident and certain of their professional identity and value. And they can express it regardless of where they're employed at the time. So that's how I define career renewal. And I was really looking to see, why do some people get there and why do some people not get there? So I'll start with like the basic foundation, which is that everyone who gets laid off thinks it's like one of the most terrible things that's happened to them. And I was a little surprised by this, because I thought, well, people who've been laid off in this period of 2008 to 2010, well, everyone was watching the economy kind of crumble around us. And so everybody must have expected it. And despite that, people are just devastated by the experience of being laid off. And they would say, I felt abandoned. I felt so vulnerable. I felt mistreated, disrespected. I felt afraid about the future. I was worried about money. I was worried about where I would fit in the world again. And it was like universally the response to being laid off. And what I found was the most interesting thing about this, as I was deepening my research, was that I would start talking to my friends who were employed, or people who I was working with at Columbia at the time, or my friends and family who had nothing to do with my research or my life at Columbia. And I would outline all these things that people were describing about how they felt post-layoff. And people would say, wait, Nayla, I have a job and I still feel powerless. I still feel like I'm at the mercy of my boss or my organization, and I'm not calling the shots. And that I don't know if I'm getting paid what I'm worth, and all these kind of big questions about the relationship with work. And so as I was focusing my research on these people who had been laid off, it was kind of still percolating in my head that there's this relationship with work needs to be looked at, whether or not we have a job, so to speak. So that's what I found. First, everybody feels devastated by the event of layoff, even if you hate your job. It's like a breakup, right? Like, I don't necessarily want this relationship to go anywhere, but I want to be the one to break up with you.
Even if it's an abusive relationship, it's
I don't want to be dumped. Right. I want to end it, right? And that came up a lot. Like, a number of people would say to me, it wasn't a great job. I knew it wasn't a great fit. I knew I was vulnerable, but I still felt hurt personally. I felt like it was a big statement about my worth and my value when they broke up with me. I wanted to be the one to give my resignation and to walk out of the relationship. So I think that alone was pretty interesting. So as I was digging into the 24 people who were in my study, I kind of started lumping them into groups. And I said, okay, I was talking to them 4 years on average post-layoff. And there were some people who were what I call stuck. So several years later, they still hadn't found something of meaning to do professionally. They were still either underemployed or unemployed, just couldn't find the momentum to get out of the position they were in. A large number of people were what I called settled or accommodating, meaning that they had found something to do, but nothing really had changed in their job involvement. They had done what I call changing the wallpaper. So maybe the business cards looked different and the parking lot was different and the office looked different, but in fact, they were the same. And then this third group of people did what I call thrived, and they experienced this career renewal, and something was really fundamentally changed about their relationship with work. And those are the people I really wanted to dig into and understand what was happening with them.
What were the characteristics that differentiated the thrive versus the stuck and the settled groups?
So here's, I think, what the best news about the whole study was, is that it really had less to do with characteristics and had more to do with behavior. Because one of the assumptions I had walking into the study was like people who are generally more optimistic or positive or who have these certain kind of personality traits would be in better shape. And I was relieved to know that it really doesn't have as much to do with how you're wired naturally. It has a lot to do with what you do. So just adopting a certain set of behaviors. And that is, the great news about that is those behaviors are something we can all use, we can all step into and practice. And as I built my career post dissertation, a lot of the work I do is coaching. And this set of behaviors builds the framework for a lot of my coaching work because it's something anybody can do.
All right, big reveal. Big reveal.
Big reveal. Here we go.
What are the golden secrets here?
All right. So there's 5 things that people who thrive post career trauma, let's call it, do that people who don't do these things have less great outcomes. So 5 practices, I break them into 2 buckets, right? There's a stream of what I call inner work, and there's a stream of outer work. So the inner work is more about gaining perspective and more private internal work. And then the outer work is around kind of putting your findings and insights into the world. So I'm just going to go in sequence and I'll tell you a little bit about how they show up. And I'd love to hear from you how you're seeing this in your own experience, in the people that you work with, you collaborate with, the other consultants who you benchmark with, et cetera.
Great.
So the first thing was that people who thrived, they use their network really differently than most people are trained to do, right? So what these people do is they learn about themselves from their network. So most of us are conditioned to think about your network as a source of access, right? Like you want to build a broad and deep network because you want people at different stages of their career, in different companies, in different industries. And we, for better or for worse, I think still think about networking as a series of transactions, right? If I do something nice for you, then you will do something nice for me later, right? You'll introduce me to someone, I'll get you a ticket to an event. You'll help get my resume to the top of a pile, and I'll make sure you can get, access to somebody who you want for your podcast. The people who I was studying were using their networks really differently, and they were using their networks to learn about themselves, to get beyond the kind of what can you tell me about your industry or your company, but what can you tell me about me? What do I not know about how I work, where you see me show up at my best, the kinds of places where you think my skills are the most useful. And it's really focused on the candidate, the person who's experienced that career trauma. And there's so many reasons why this is not intuitive for us, especially when we are under or unemployed, right? Where we feel there's a common thread with everyone I spoke to, which is this feeling of shame, a feeling of like I was disposable. Whether or not that's a rational or a logical feeling to have when we're laying off hundreds or dozens of people, there is this sense of internalizing that something was wrong with me. And so I was disposable. And that accompanying feeling of shame prevents a lot of people from entering conversations where it feels like I have to ask someone who has something for something I don't have. But when the conversation pivots to being about learning and not about access, then it's a conversation between peers and equals. And it doesn't matter who's got what job at what level. We're just here to have a learning conversation.
Now this is interesting to me because maybe I'm giving people the wrong advice here, or because what I'm hearing from you is people who thrived used it to learn about themselves, use their network. What I often counsel people or try to do myself is, or when people ask me like, hey, I'm trying to, search for a job or something, I tell people like, make phone calls, touch the market, but don't go out and approach people and say, hey, look at my resume. What do you think of this? Like, what do you think would be a good role for me? Like, because people don't care about you, like, and they don't know, right? But people don't really like having that conversation of looking at your resume or thinking about your strengths and weaknesses. But what people are happy to do is call them up and say, hey, you're the, CFO at this, $100 million fintech. I'm trying to learn about that industry. I'd love to hear about how you got to that role and about what you do and what's going on in that industry, because people love to talk about themselves. So I guess my approach to that is is just focus on the other person and trying to learn, like, here, tell me your perspective about what's going on in your world, and not to say, oh, and what do you think about me? But maybe I've been, giving people bad advice. What you react to that?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't want to characterize one thing as good or bad, right? And I think that's, in general, everything that I found in my research, and when I think about the ways in which I coach my clients or I talk to my students, I try not to use the good or bad. I think that there's room for variety and for both approaches. I think there's a lot of utility in talking to people about industry. And it's true that everyone's the star of their own movie. So what most of us want to talk about is ourselves, frankly. And I think that when you think about broadening your network and getting industry exposure and just starting to understand something that's new for you, it's really smart to say, talk to me about what's happening in your industry, in your company, your career, et cetera. But our goal in this conversation is to say, how do I change my relationship with work? When work has bruised me and beaten me down, and whether that's because of layoff or because I just am in the wrong place at the wrong time, how do I heal my relationship with work so that I can feel that sense of renewal, that sense of agency and choice? If that's the end game in this particular kind of networking, I think you want to blend the approaches. I think there's value in learning about companies and people and industries. I think there's a lot of value in learning about you. So what would that mean? That would mean that you'd have to be very intelligent about who you select to have these conversations with. And so that's not available to everyone, right? If I want to say to 5 people in my network, tell me what I need to know about me. Tell me what you observed about my best and worst moments, for the places where I added the most value and contributed the most. I have to be really intelligent about who I choose. Mm-hmm. But it's a different kind of networking. I guess that might be one of the takeaways, right? There's a lot of value in what you're proposing to the people who ask you for advice. And I think there's another way to think about networking also. So maybe a little bit of both.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is your kind of question about, hey, reflect me back my strengths, weaknesses. That might be for people that actually kind of know you relatively well and can give you some mirror image feedback. So, okay, cool. So that's point one. So differences in how they reach out to people.
Yeah. What so I call it learning. Yeah, learning about your network.
Okay, cool.
Learning about yourself from your network.
Okay.
The second thing is investing in yourself outside of work. And this often seems counterintuitive because when you are underemployed or you're unemployed, like the last thing you think you have time for is like Italian lessons or, taking another spin class. But what I found is that investing in yourself outside of work, just 2 things. The first thing it does is it heals the scar tissue that is a result of a bad work experience, right? And the truth is, we spend something like, 90,000 hours of our lifetime at work. So when that goes bad, it's going to leave a mark, right? Like any relationship, when it goes bad, there's scar tissue. And reminding yourself what it is you love to do and who you are outside of work and treating yourself like the whole person that you are does a lot to kind of refine those feelings so that you feel like yourself again. The other thing having an investment outside of work does is it right sizes the role of work in our lives. So I know that I have been obsessed with my job in the good times and in the bad times. And like in the best of times, I still sometimes wake up thinking about work. I go to bed thinking about work. God knows in the worst of times, I have woken up thinking about work and gone to bed thinking about work. And if you're unemployed or you're underemployed or you've been broken up with by your job, it's just as bad, right? You think about work all the time. And so what doing something that you love and that's good for you outside of work does is put work where it belongs, right? It's part of your life. It's not your whole life. And what I found are the people who had picked something up or retrieved like an old hobby, something that they had loved to do. So this might be sports, it might be arts, it might be taking an Italian lesson to kind of keep your brain sharp when you're not working. When they went back to work, they had good habits around having a broad and diverse set of things they do in their weeks and months. And it allowed work to kind of fit into their lives rather than dominate their lives. And I think that's something a lot of us, especially for working parents, we just don't do, right? We think, well, I have work and I have family. This was something where I really found myself taking a really strong lesson from my participants in my study to say, oh yeah, that there's more to me than just being a professional and being a wife and mother. And I want to make sure I'm, feeding that part of me too.
Yeah.
So,
What were some of the things that the Thrive group did in terms of investing in themselves outside of
yeah.
work?
Sure. A lot of them would take the, I think everyone has that thing they wish they had like kept on since they were kids or teenagers or in college. So I had a number of people who had an artistic venture that they had let fall. So painting or pottery or something that they loved and really enjoyed in their youth that they had let fall to the wayside. I had a number of people who had made a lot of time to read things that were not connected to work. Like everyone has a reading list of the novels they wish they'd picked up or the biography of that person they admire. And so a lot of them made time to read things that had nothing to do with seeking a job, succeeding at a job, that kind of stuff. A lot of travel. And then a lot of things for personal wellness too. A lot of the people I talked to, whether or not they appeared in my study, would say, you know what, I had let myself get out of shape, or I had stopped playing tennis with my old club that I loved, and they just made time for it. And then when they were back to work, it was part of their routine to say, you know what, I do this thing. I play tennis 3 hours a week and I got to just make it happen. I can't let that fall aside again. Well, how about you? What do you do outside of work?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, let's see. One thing that I love to do is build things. So we have this farm in Pennsylvania, and it's been in my family for 5 generations. And so with my wife and kids, we go back there for 6-7 weeks during the summer, and every year I try to do one building project with my dad. So we've built a tree house, a chicken coop, a garden, a couple sheds. Over this past Father's Day, my dad and I, along with my daughters and my son, who helped, we built a lookout tower up in a tree with a bench for reading. So so that's kind of, so much of my time as a consultant is indoors on paper, doing something relatively intangible. It's nice to actually put in some lag bolts and
sure.
and deal with some pressure treated lumber. So.
I think that's probably true for a lot of us. Like a lot of our work is very cerebral, and I can pour hours and hours into something and never have a product to show for it. And so it's nice. So for me, it's a lot of time in the kitchen. Like I love to make things, and that's I'm not as creative as I want to be in other ways. I can't really draw or paint, but I can make things in the kitchen that taste great and even look great most of the time. And so that to me it's all those things you talked about, like getting something from beginning to end. It provides just a retreat from the chaos of work and from the overwhelm of work. And making a commitment to myself that I want to have dinner that I make on the table at least 3 nights a week means that I have to shut the laptop at a certain point in the day. And that's important. Otherwise, work will creep into every corner, every spare moment. So, yeah. So that's, all right. So that was the second practice.
So that's number 2. Okay.
Mm-hmm. The third thing is that the people, and this was like 100% true for everyone I spoke to who met my criteria for thriving, for experiencing career renewal, they had developed a reflective practice. So what's a reflective practice? John Dewey, who's like the father of American education, had this expression that we don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. So having the time and space to make meaning of what's happening to us and to interpret it and to apply insights into the next thing. And 100% of the people who met my criteria were doing this. Didn't always look the same, but a reflective practice is anything that creates that space and time for you to think and evaluate, to feel, and to draw insights. So for some people, this looks like prayer or meditation. For some people, it looks like writing, like journaling. For some people, it means walking or exercising, running, something that feels meditative in nature. For some people, it meant a support group, or in some cases, counseling, like just having someone who provides that forum where you can experiment and explore ideas. And it allows you to draw on things like your experience, of course, your values, allows you to manage your emotions, your attitude. There was a chance for a lot of people to think back on other times where they've had setbacks. So whether it was in sports or in school, or if they had trouble at work in the past, to really say, okay, what did I learn last time that can keep me motivated, can keep me positive, can keep me moving this time? And again, it's one of those things that we might look at and say, well, if I don't have a job, I certainly shouldn't be spending 30 minutes journaling in the morning. I should be looking for a job. But it is essential in my view. And when I think about the work I do now with private clients who are looking to change their careers or who have been laid off and are trying to get back on their feet, this is something I insist upon, that they do something that gets them out of their head for a little bit, out of the kind of runaway train of thoughts, into creating some space so they can learn from what they're experiencing and draw on the richness of their other experiences to have deeper insights.
Wow. That really resonates. Just even 5 or 10 minutes a day of writing in a journal, doing morning pages like Julia Cameron recommends, or, some meditation. It just, magic starts to happen. And like just ideas seem to come to you when you start that. That was amazing. So that was like 100% of the thrivers were doing that. And is it also true that the stuck people, or the stuck or the settled people were not doing that?
We're not.
Wow.
We're not.
That's amazing.
And it's funny, before we got on, I think before we started recording, you mentioned the idea of routine. Like, what do people do? What do I do for routine? And I think this is the kind of thing, some people are naturally wired would be the wrong word, but they have habits around this before career chaos steps in, right? Either you're an active journaler or a meditator, or, you have that long walk every morning with your neighbor who you talk to and gives you that moment of reflection. Not everyone, the good news about this is that most people who I studied who did it, learned how to do it the hard way. They learned it because they felt backed into a corner by the pressure and the sadness and the frustration of this experience. And they were testing things out, which we'll talk about in a minute. And they kind of found that, after 4 weeks of just waking up feeling awful every day, my dad gave me a notebook, or my wife said, we're going for a walk, or like something kind of pushed them into a routine. So, I say that because I think it's important to know that it's not just like the people who were meditators before layoff who found this practice helpful. This is the epitome of a learned behavior, of just something where you say, I can put in 20 minutes a day. I can build it into my schedule to write, to pray, to go for this walk, to join a group that meets twice a week to talk about this stuff. It's available to everybody. And you mentioned Julia Cameron, which I love. And I give that book to a lot of people for the same reason, that it's a way of feeding ourselves that we just don't do anymore. And I think it's super critical. And the evidence is there in my research and in every client I've worked with since, that this really unlocks a lot of access to the richness of our own insight.
So learn about yourself from your network, invest in yourself outside of work, have some reflective practice. What is number 4?
Okay, so now we're going to move outside of like the inner work into action. That's externally facing.
All right.
So I call these practices to be around claiming your value broadly. And the first one of them is owning your expertise. And this was a big surprise for me. And this was also something that was deeply resonant for me as I was doing the research. And I'll tell you why. Owning your expertise is about being able to be really confident, clear, and certain about what it is that you're great at and what you do to add value that's agnostic of your organization or your title. And of course, when you have been laid off, you can't hang your worth on, I do this function at this company. You have to be able to say what it is that you do, regardless of who employs you, who pays you for that. And this probably will feel very available to you as a consultant. I'd love to hear the story of how you got here. But I'll tell you that for me, being the dean of students at Columbia Business School was a really easy way to describe what I did. So if I met someone at a cocktail party, or if I was somewhere in town and someone said, oh, what do you do? Which is one of my least favorite questions, but what do you do? I could say, I'm the dean of students at Columbia Business School. And it was like pithy. It fit into like a text box. More or less, people had a sense of what that meant. When, as a result of all of this, many things that were happening in my life in the period that I was doing the dissertation, I started thinking, maybe I want to do something else. One of the things I found was that being attached to that title made it really hard for me to think about what I was good at. Because what I knew was that I was the dean of students at Columbia Business School. And when it really came down to like, what are the things I know how to do? Like, what is the value I add? What is my expertise? I needed help figuring that out because I had become so defined by the title and the role in the organization. And once that's gone, Like if you're no longer employed, you can't say I'm the such and such at the such and such. You have to say, this is what I do. And I find that a lot of the work I do with clients is around answering this question, because everyone knows what their job is. Not everyone knows what they're expert at or what they're great at or where they add value.
And so, and when you say that owning that their expertise, was that just personally coming to terms with it, or was it like being able to articulate it and put it on LinkedIn, or being able to say it with a straight face to somebody? Like what do you mean?
All of the above.
Okay.
All of the above. And it's so interesting because you're right. You start with being able to answer for yourself. Like, what is it that I actually do well? Like, what is it? And I sometimes say to people, like, what do people call you for? Like, what is the reason you're brought to a meeting besides your title, besides like the role, the official role that you have in a company? Why are you asked to be in a meeting? When do people knock on your door and say, can I have a second? I need your insight on something, right? That you start to answer the question about what you do in those moments. So first, it's for most of us to say, like, I don't run the office of this, that, and the other thing. I do this. I solve problems. I create programs. Whatever the act is that you do, whatever the thinking is that you do. And then there's the part about getting comfortable talking about it. Right. And here's like one place in my study where gender really showed up, because my study's not about gender. But in this place, it was really interesting that when I would say to people in the course of all these interviews, like, what was the thing you thought you would do professionally right after the layoff? And on average, I was talking to people who had 10 to 12 years work experience minimum. All of them had a college degree. Most of them had a graduate degree. And all the men I talked to said, well, I thought I'd consult. I thought I'll hang a shingle and I'll just share my wisdom. I'll solve problems for other people.
Because right? Lord knows anybody can be a consultant.
God knows. All you got to do is hang a sign, right? Print up a business card. Voila, you're a consultant. Every guy I talked to said this. The women all said, well, I'm probably going to go back to school and get another master's. And then maybe I'll take a consulting skills course. And then probably I'll get certified in something. And then I'll think about consulting.
Wow.
Right. And it was 100% of the women said that. I mean, the women who had 20 years of experience were like, I have to go, like, my ability to consult or to be an expert is around the corner. I just need to do a couple things to get there. And the men were like, I'm ready. Put me in. Right. So, and I thought that was so interesting because the women didn't have less experience. They just hadn't learned how to talk about what they knew how to do. And so you mentioned like LinkedIn and all that. Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is knowing what you know how to do and figuring out what lights you up, what you're great at, where you're uniquely qualified to add value, solve problems, create opportunities, but then to be confident about telling the story without wanting to vomit, right? With being able to tell the story in a way that feels real and feels comfortable and meaningful. But it was surprising to me how many people, as a virtue of having their "what do you do" question answered by a title, were just suddenly like, "Oh my God, I got to answer that question without my business card."
But in all seriousness, I mean that's actually, I guess somewhat surprising to me, this stark difference, and also, just concerning. What do you think is the driver of that? And about why there was that gender difference that you found.
It's a great question. I don't know if I can answer it broadly. I can tell you for what it was like for me, and I can, if I refer to a couple of the clients I've worked with lately, I think it might be, in my case, especially when you're achievement oriented, there's these kind of milestones we create for ourselves around, if I could hit a certain title and a certain role and a certain level in my organization, then I will have made it, right? That equals success. And so I think that becomes the yardstick through which we measure great, right? Like if I have something I can say on LinkedIn that sounds really impressive, or that it meets the criteria to get me, the A+. And a lot of my clients are women, and a lot of us come, I don't want to point my finger at any one organization, institution, family unit, whatever, but there's a lot around measurement and how we have been trained and rewarded for measuring up. And what I think that might do is just pivot the attention really on the external yardstick of greatness and away from our internal definition of greatness, or success, or competence for that matter. So I think that might be part of it, that, in a landscape that has this kind of collecting credentials and degrees and titles and institutions with great names so that we feel recognized and it means like, oh, we've done something meaningful. It's a move away from saying, oh, well, the thing that's meaningful is that I know how to solve this problem or I know how to do this thing. So I think part of it is just early on to talk, and I talk to my women students about this a lot, like early on in your career to think about what it is you know how to do, what it is you know how to solve, and how you contribute, agnostic of the title, agnostic of the role. So I think, I think that's part of it, at least for me.
Well, I mean, this research I think that you've done is so helpful to kind of, and I'm sure you're coaching clients, but to make that apparent, to men and to women, and perhaps someone who thought she had to go back to school and like, oh, everybody would have to go and get another master's and get certified and so forth. Making it clear that, all the men think they could just go out and do it. Like maybe that making that clear that, it's actually not necessary. And,
I think that's really true. And I think that is something that actually leads really well into the final, practice, which is around conducting experiments. So the last thing that everybody who was in this group was doing differently is they were putting experiments out there. They were building these small, safe ways of testing ideas and impressions, assumptions, and they were gathering more data. So one of them was, do I need to go back? I remember one woman who had worked in a nonprofit, and she was very attached to the mission of the nonprofit and had been climbing up, and then they just lost their funding and they ended up laying off like more than half of their team. And she was thinking that if she wanted, maybe she'd use this period of time after layoff to get more certifications, because in the long run, her goal was to run a nonprofit. And she said, I don't have a ton of fundraising experience. I need it. I'll need it if I want to be the president or the chairman or chairperson of a nonprofit. So I should go take a fundraising course. And when she got the price tag of the course, she kind of had this moment where she's like, I don't think I should be spending this right now. So I wonder how I can figure out if I actually need the course to get the experience. And she basically pitched her services pro bono to another nonprofit she'd been volunteering with and said, I'd love to help you with this fundraising thing you're doing, and to see if there are skills that job requires that I don't have or that I could learn by doing. And that was just one example of how people were just designing these experiments to test some of that thinking. Is it true that I must work in a classroom to be happy? Is it true that I must have this course to be able to add value in this particular way? Is it true that I don't like client-facing work anymore? So they were designing these small experiments that they could control and then learn from as part of their recovery from the experience. And that, I think, for me personally, has been the most impactful. And it's been a big driver in how I've shaped my life since Columbia. And it is probably, I try not to give too much advice, but if I were to give a lot of advice, this would be it, which is figure if there's something you're curious about or interested in, or you can tell that you have a belief that might need to be challenged, design an experiment to find out. Something safe, something small, something manageable, and put it out there.
Wow. I'm such a fan of that, of experiments, or, you could position it as a side project, but just doing small things. Like, I guess somehow I stumbled on, kind of that philosophy myself.
Yeah.
Like a number of years ago, I just thought, it'd be kind of cool to give training on, consulting skills. So just, found someone to donate a room, like a law firm or something, and put it out there in the Columbia Business School listserv, and lo and behold, like 12 people, 14 people signed up for a day. It was, it was super fun. Right. And that was years ago. And then that kind of led to doing these professional development sessions, that kind of eventually helped grow into Umbrex. So,
There you go.
I mean, just doing little side projects or start a blog or just start something and start it super small and, using free Google listserv or whatever.
Sure.
And that's amazing. What were some of the experiments that you saw people doing that, can you give any examples of those experiments that you gave one about the nonprofit, any others?
Yeah. So some of them looked like the job search itself, and some of them looked like creating work, what I call creating work or making work. There's, for instance, I had one of my participants was a guy from Wall Street who had been laid off. This was like half his firm. And he was someone who had what he thought was an aversion to networking, or he thought it felt kind of smarmy and icky to talk to people about what he did and to ask people what they did. He just didn't like it. But when, 6 months in, he hadn't found something, he wasn't getting, of course, bites from submitting to job boards or anything like that. He called someone he used to work with and they said, try to give yourself a big target and see if you can have 100 conversations in 100 days. And that's like a big number, right? But he made himself a board. He made himself like a whiteboard in his office at home. And he said, made a 100-day calendar. And said, I'm going to have 100 conversations in 100 days just to see if I can do it, without hating myself at the end of it. And he almost gamified it, right? And it turns out that he didn't get all the way to 100. That's a really big number. But he got to about 60 conversations in 100 days. And it did a couple things. One, it gave him a really big target to work with. And it ended up yielding the right conversation at the right time for the right opportunity. But more importantly, it tested his assumption that the networking was going to feel awful and that he would hate himself for doing it. So that was one. A lot of people did what this kind of side hustle thing you're talking about, which is like either in or outside of their scope of primary work. So I had a couple participants who had these things they love to do. I had one who was a baker. I had one who was a jewelry maker. I had one who was a spin instructor who basically said this other thing I love in my life that is not to do with my main work. I'm going to see if I can monetize it. I'm going to see if I can have fun with it. If I can learn about marketing by selling jewelry on eBay. And kind of just building those little kinds of experiments. And then I had other people who were doing side hustles that ended up morphing into their real job, into primary jobs. So that woman who went to the nonprofit and said, I want to think about how to gain skills in fundraising, and I want to do it through work, not through a class. She ended up doing a great job over the course of 8 months, and it actually converted into a full-time role. And now she's leading that organization. So I think that there's a lot of ways to play with the idea of experimentation, but the important thing is that it provides data to you, about do you love this thing? Can you become good at this thing? Can you thrive in an environment that maybe you thought was not for you? And that's how my coaching business started. I was telling a friend while I was still at Columbia that this was where I wanted to spend at least a third of my time. And he said, put it out there. So the people that, you've worked with and have been your students over the last 15 years, and just let them know that you're going to be launching this side hustle and see what happens. And I sweated for the first 2 days that I was crafting the email and sending it out to, groups of people. And it yielded so much knowledge for me about what I love to do and what I'm great at and where I add value. And it turns out that it can be 30% of my work, and it's been really great for me. Even stepping out of Columbia, period, was a big experiment for me, right? Like I made the decision as part of all of this research I was doing. I was giving a lot of thought to what I was great at, where I added the most value, how I was feeling in relationship to my work. Was work running my life, or was I running my life? And I ended up saying, I think I need to step out of higher ed for a while and try something in corporate and see if I have this belief that I have something to say and that I have a way of looking at leadership development and of creating programs and building leaders that's really useful. I also carry an assumption that corporate might not be for me, but I want to know. I don't want to just walk around with that belief because, I spent 20 years on a college campus. And so I kind of experimented myself out of one job into another. So I think all of us kind of owe ourselves this way of testing. And that's why I say start small and then you can grow your experiments and be big.
Yeah. So you've taken your own medicine.
In many ways. So
if someone uses their network to learn about themselves. They invest in themselves outside of work. They have a reflective practice. They claim their own value, and they experiment. Do you have any thing to suggest, maybe with your coaching practice, that it's not just something inherent in the folks that were thriving, but if someone who were stuck adopts those practices or some subset of them, that it will then start changing, moving the needle for their career. So is it something that someone can decide to adopt those behaviors, and then it'll actually kind of make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm 100% a believer that we can adopt behaviors that are better for us and that will move us in the right direction. I think, and I've seen it not only in the research I did for this dissertation, but also in my own work, both with my kind of day job and the people I work with there, and in my coaching and my teaching. I think the hard part is really wanting to make the change and then sticking to it, like building the scaffolding and structure that make you get on the right track until these new behaviors are habits. And then it is the way that you're working. I have clients who, so this is the framework I use when I talk to people and coach people all the time, right? To say, there's a lot of other tools and processes I use, but when people say to me, I feel stuck, I'm not happy, I know I can do better, or I just need to get back to work and I've been out of work for whatever reason, I'll use most of these tools to say, look, let's start creating a direction for you and let's start building some momentum. I think the hard thing, like anything, like developing a healthy workout or eating habit, is that there's a lot of things we say we want, and yet we've somehow become attached to the way things are, right? Like there is something about saying that, like, oh, woe is me, I've been wronged by work, that feels maybe not great, but it feels familiar. And what this requires you to do is a lot of work. There's work behind this in the same way there's work behind getting ready to run a marathon or to lose 20 pounds or anything else that you want for yourself. That's what's hard, it's not knowing what you want, but it's kind of making the daily, weekly, monthly changes and having that consistency to get where you want to get. And the thing about the people I studied was that they felt like their options were exhausted, right? When you've been out of work and you need to pay your rent or your mortgage and your kids need to go to school or camp, there is the momentum to get the meaning behind getting it done feels really, really big. I think the hard thing is that when you find someone who's in a job that's acceptable, it's not great, but it's acceptable, it's easy to kind of stay and be happy with that discomfort or be content with that discomfort, rather than to say, I'm going to push myself to put these practices into work consistently to get where I want to get. And that's why people, join groups or coaching, so that they have someone who's going to keep them accountable, keep them moving through it, but they have to want it.
Any tips that you have that you maybe use with your coaching clients on how practically to implement some of these new habits? Because it's so tough to change your own behavior. Anything that you found really helps people, implement one or more of these?
Well, there was an article, I get the Daily Stoic mailing list thing, and there was a piece yesterday about routine and structure. And I hate to admit that I have to do that. Like, I'm not someone, for a lot of the things for work, and this is the field I spent all my time thinking about. So this is less difficult for me. But for me, for instance, getting physically fit is not something that I'm like naturally wired towards. I don't wake up and think like, woo, can't wait to put my sneakers on and go to the gym. So I have to build routine and infrastructure. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people. We kind of act our way into new ways of thinking rather than kind of waiting for that moment of inspiration to strike. So I think building routines into your calendar and having people who keep you accountable, for me, it's a trainer, really makes a big difference. And so for people who I'm working with, a lot of the time I'm playing that role of accountability partner to kind of, you said you wanted to do this thing. This is the work for this week. Are you doing this week's work? If you're someone who can live by your calendar, if your partner, your spouse can play that role, if your running group or if your career group can help play that role, I think having a routine that's, I call it scaffolding, like building the infrastructure to keep things going, even when you don't want to. Because if we're waiting for the moment of want, I think it's going to be hard. And we're going to have moments that feel very inspired and productive. And we're going to have days when we just want to watch Netflix. So I think having scaffolding makes a big, big difference. And I don't think it's a one size fits all for scaffolding. I think sometimes it's people, sometimes it's process, like your calendar. And that's why testing is so important. It's another form of experimentation. Like, let's try this for a week. Can you get up? If your Outlook calendar tells you you need to spend the hour between 9 and 10 at the gym, or 9 and 10 making 2 phone calls, and you're able to stick to the calendar, fantastic. If that's not working, let's try something else. But I think building the consistency through routine is, for me, for my clients, from everything I read, I think that's the way to go.
Nayla, it has been awesome having you on the show, and great to hear about this. These are super practical tips, and I'm motivated to now go back and think about how I can implement more of this.
Well, that's great. Thank you.
And
well, it's been great to be here, and I'm always happy to talk to you and to talk about this stuff.
And I wanted to ask you, before I forgot, how can people find you, Nayla, if they wanted to follow up or potentially approach you for some coaching or find out more about your work? What is the best place for people to go?
So I'm hoping this summer my website will be up and running, naylabahri.com. But right now it just points to my LinkedIn profile, which is how a lot of people find me through referrals. But my name is my website and my handle for my LinkedIn, and I'd love to hear from people.
And we will include those links in the show notes.
Well, thank you so much.
Nayla, it's been great to have you.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. Unleashed is sponsored by Umbrex, the world's first global community of top-tier independent management consultants. The mission of Umbrex is to create opportunities for independent management consultants to meet, share lessons learned, and collaborate. I'd love to get your feedback and hear any questions that you'd like to see us answer on this show. You can email me at unleashed@umbrex.com. That's UMBREX.com. If you found anything on the show helpful, it would be a real gift if you would let a friend know about the show and take a minute to leave a review on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. And if you subscribe, our show will get delivered to your device every Monday. Our audio engineer is Dave Nelson. Our theme song was composed by Gary Negbauer, and I'm your host, Will Bachman. Thanks for listening.